The distinction between subject and object is a fundamental concept in philosophy. A subject refers to a being that exercises agency, undergoes conscious experiences, and exists in relation to other entities external to itself. In this sense, a subject can be any individual, person, or observer. Conversely, an object is anything observed or experienced by a subject. This distinction, however, becomes nuanced in cases where one subject perceives another subject as an object, highlighting the interplay of perspectives. A simplified differentiation between subjects and objects is that of an observer versus the observed. This distinction relates to the philosophical concepts of subjectivity, knowledge, ideas, or information dependent on a subject, and objectivity, which refers to those independent of any subject. The term object originates from the Latin objectus, meaning to throw or put before, derived from obicere, to throw against, combining ob, against, and jacere, to throw. In contrast, subject shares the root jacere but adds the prefix sub, under, emphasizing its subordinate or dependent relational positioning. In a broad sense, the term object encompasses a general category that includes anything eligible for reference, quantification, or conceptualization. Synonyms for object in this broad sense include terms like thing, being, entity, item, existent, unit, and individual. However, in ordinary language, objects are typically associated with material entities. Social conventions may discourage referring to animate beings, especially humans, as objects, favoring terms like entity or being instead. Philosophers sometimes contrast objects with properties, defining objects as entities that are not reducible to properties. Unlike properties, objects cannot be referred to by predicates. Abstract objects are a point of contention, with some philosophers including them within the category of objects, while others do not. Related terms in this context include substance, individual, and particular. Two primary definitions of objects exist: objects as entities that lack consciousness or the capacity to experience, objects as entities that are experienced, allowing for the possibility of a subject being simultaneously an object when perceived by another. The properties and relations of objects are key to their description. For instance, describing an apple typically involves its properties, shape, size, color, temperature, and its relations, such as on the table or bigger than other apples. Philosophical frameworks vary on whether objects can exist independently of their properties, and, if so, in what manner. Two significant problems related to objects are the problem of change and the problem of substance. Correspondingly, two prominent theories of objecthood are substance theory, which posits that objects, substances, are distinct from their properties; bundle theory, which argues that objects are merely bundles of their properties. In his seminal work, The Mullamadhyama Karika, Indian philosopher Nagarjuna challenges the dichotomy between objects as mere collections of properties or as entities separate from their properties. Through meticulous analysis, Nagarjuna demonstrates that both perspectives collapse under scrutiny. This paradox forms the foundation for his proposed solution, pratatya samutpada, or dependent origination, a central concept in Buddhist thought. While dependent origination traditionally applies to caused objects, Nagarjuna extends its scope to all objects. He introduces a critical distinction between dependent designation, the idea that objects depend on conceptual designation, and dependent origination, suggesting that all objects are contextually dependent and lack intrinsic existence. Nagarjuna argues that discussions about the nature of objects must be grounded in the conventions that give rise to them. Objects, therefore, are valid only within the frameworks that assert their existence, undermining the idea of inherent, self-sufficient entities. His approach aligns with the Buddhist rejection of dualism and reinforces the notion that ultimate reality transcends conventional distinctions. In contrast, early modern Western philosophy, as exemplified by René Descartes, formalized the subject-object separation within a dualistic framework. Descartes distinguished between thought, subjectivity, as the essence of the mind, and extension, occupying space, as the essence of matter. This dualism posits that consciousness resides exclusively in the subject, whose existence is self-evident through its capacity to think and doubt. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. However, the existence and nature of the objects perceived by the subject remain questionable, as they may lack independent reality or intrinsic value outside the observer's cognition. From this perspective, the properties of an object, such as color, size, weight, smell, taste, and location, are attributes experienced by the subject. Objects manifest themselves through these properties, which appear to change in consistent and unified ways. This raises a critical philosophical question: what underlies these changing properties? Two major philosophical approaches attempt to address this change problem. Substance theory posits that an underlying substance accounts for the continuity amidst change. Substances are thought to exist independently of their properties, but are only experienced indirectly through them. However, this leads to the problem of substance. How can one affirm the existence of a substance that cannot be directly experienced or scientifically verified? Bundle theory, championed by David Hume, rejects the notion of an underlying substance. According to this view, an object is no more than the collection, or bundle, of its properties, with no need to postulate an unobservable substrate. Nagarjuna's critique parallels this debate by challenging the very notion of intrinsic existence. By emphasizing dependence, whether on causes, conditions, or conceptual designations, he dissolves the rigid separation between subject and object, pointing instead to the interconnected, dynamic nature of reality. While Western dualism often seeks to reconcile the mind and matter divide, Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka philosophy reframes the problem by rejecting intrinsic separations altogether, advocating instead for a relational and contextual understanding of existence. The concept of the subject as a central term in discussions of human consciousness emerged prominently with the German idealists, as a response to David Hume's radical skepticism. Hume's conclusion, that the self is nothing more than a fleeting bundle of perceptions, posed a challenge to notions of a unified subject. The idealists, notably Immanuel Kant and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, sought to explain how this fragmented bundle could be experienced as a cohesive whole, a single subject. Hume had suggested that the imagination, through habitual processes, organizes sense impressions over time into coherent experiences. The imagination must by long custom acquire the same method of thinking, and run along the parts of space and time in conceiving its objects. Building on this, Kant introduced the idea that the unity of the subject is a necessary precondition for experience itself. While Kant upheld the possibility of objective knowledge within the limits of human understanding, he emphasized that such knowledge is always mediated by subjective conditions. This duality between the noumenal, things as they are, and phenomenal, things as they appear, realms underscored the inescapable role of subjectivity in human cognition. For Kant, the subject imposes a structure on the chaos of sense impressions, synthesizing them into a coherent experience. This act of synthesis is not passive but an active function of the transcendental unity of apperception, which serves as the foundation of self-consciousness. Hegel expanded on this notion by conceptualizing the subject as a dynamic, self-constituting process. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel describes the subject as the process of reflectively mediating itself with itself. He begins with an Aristotelian idea that the subject is the unmoved which is also self-moving, emphasizing that true subjectivity arises not from external forces but from the subject's inner activity. For Hegel, this inner activity is characterized by negativity, a self-propelling force that introduces distinctions and oppositions. He describes subjectivity as the bifurcation of the simple. It is the doubling which sets up opposition, and then again the negation of this indifferent diversity and of its antithesis. Thus, the subject does not emerge as a pre-given, unified entity, but as a result of negation, a dialectical process in which diversity is first introduced and then overcome. This process, referred to as the negation of negation, allows the subject to perceive itself as a unified whole. Hegel's subject, therefore, operates as a structural effect, a unity formed by negating the very multiplicity it produces. For Hegel, the subject, the I or consciousness, and the object, the world or reality, are interdependent and mutually constitutive. They are not separate, but rather, their interaction is what brings both into full realization. In his Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel outlines the development of consciousness from immediate sensory experience to absolute knowing. The key concept here is self-consciousness, the idea that the subject comes to know itself through its engagement with the object. However, this knowledge is not a simple reflection of reality as it exists independently of the subject. Instead, the subject actively shapes and forms its knowledge through a process of dialectical unfolding. The famous Hegelian master-slave dialectic illustrates this dynamic interaction. In this dialectic, two self-consciousnesses encounter each other, and through struggle and recognition, each becomes aware of itself through the other. This mutual recognition is essential for the development of the subject, as the self only becomes fully realized through its relation to the other, or the object. The slave, in this dialectic, is forced into labor and subjugation, but through this external labor, the slave gains a deeper understanding of the world and, ultimately, self-realization. This movement of subject and object, of conflict and reconciliation, drives the development of consciousness. Hegel rejects the notion of a subject that exists in isolation, separate from the object. For him, the subject and object are two moments in a unified totality. The object is not simply an external thing to be observed by the subject. Rather, the object is part of the process by which the subject comes to know itself. This means that subjectivity and objectivity are not separate realms, but rather intertwined in the development of self-consciousness. For Hegel, the self, subject, and the world, object, are codetermined. The world is not a mere external reality that exists independently of the subject, nor is the subject a purely isolated, inner consciousness. The development of the subject is inherently linked to the world, and the world's reality is dependent on the subject's capacity to recognize and relate to it. In this sense, Hegel provides a more integrated and dynamic account of the subject-object relationship than classical idealism or materialism. In the final stages of Hegel's dialectical process, the subject reaches absolute knowing, where the division between subject and object is overcome. Absolute knowing is not the simple merging of subject and object, but the recognition of their unity. In this state, the subject knows itself as part of the absolute totality of reality, and the object is seen not as a separate thing but as an expression of the same underlying reality. This culminates in Hegel's view that reality is rational, or the real is the rational, meaning that the entire development of the world is a manifestation of the rational process of self-realization. The subject and the object, through their dialectical interaction, unfold into one another, and reality is seen as the self-manifestation of the absolute spirit or mind. Hegel's philosophy emphasizes that the subject-object relationship is historical. The subject is not just an individual consciousness but a historical process, a part of the unfolding of history, culture, and society. For Hegel, the subject becomes fully realized only through history, as history represents the unfolding of the rational self-realization of spirit. History is not just a collection of events, but a rational process through which the subject comes to understand itself in relation to the world. In this sense, history and the development of consciousness are intertwined. Ultimately, Hegel's view of subject and object culminates in the concept of the absolute spirit, which represents the full realization of self-consciousness. The absolute spirit is both the subject and the object. It is the unity of thought and being, of spirit and world. The absolute spirit is not just a theoretical or metaphysical concept, but the totality of reality itself, fully realized through the dialectical development of subjectivity. In this way, Hegel transcends traditional subject-object dualism by showing how the two are not opposites but moments in a dynamic, unfolding process of self-realization and knowledge. The relationship between subject and object is not a static one, but a historically situated, dialectical development that leads to the eventual unity of consciousness and the world in absolute knowing. The Hegelian subject can be described as both self-restoring sameness and reflection in otherness within itself, a unity that emerges through its engagement with difference. This complex, dynamic understanding of subjectivity contrasts sharply with earlier notions of a fixed or intrinsic self. Despite popular misconceptions, the familiar framework of thesis-antithesis-synthesis, often attributed to Hegel's dialectics, is not an accurate representation of his philosophy. This terminology, which has been commonly associated with Hegel for over a century, actually originates from earlier philosophical traditions, particularly from Johann Gottlieb Fichte. The notion gained widespread currency through the accounts of Heinrich Moritz Callebaut's, whose interpretations of Hegel have since been widely discredited. As Walter Kaufmann clarifies, Fichte introduced into German philosophy the three-step of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, using these three terms. Schelling took up this terminology. Hegel did not. He never once used these three terms together to designate three stages in an argument or account in any of his books. And they do not help us understand his phenomenology, his logic, or his philosophy of history. They impede any open-minded comprehension of what he does by forcing it into a scheme which was available to him and which he deliberately spurned. While this three-step model may serve as a convenient shorthand for some aspects of Hegel's work, it is a partial and potentially misleading interpretation that requires correction. What it captures accurately is Hegel's view that truth emerges from error over the course of historical development, reflecting a progressive correction of partial truths. This underscores Hegel's commitment to a holistic view of reality, where contradictions and one-sidedness are resolved through a dynamic process of development. However, this resolution can only be recognized after the process has fully unfolded. The thesis and antithesis are not separate, alien forces opposed externally to one another, but are interrelated moments of a single, immanent process. Stephen Holgate further emphasizes that Hegel's dialectical method is not an external formula imposed upon a subject, but a method that emerges immanently from the subject matter itself. Dialectics arise not because of an externally applied framework, but because contradiction is inherent in the object of inquiry. Hegel's approach involves a deep, thoughtful engagement with the nature of the object, allowing its internal tensions and contradictions to unfold organically. In this sense, Hegel's dialectics resist simplification into a rigid method such as thesis-antithesis-synthesis. Instead, they reflect a dynamic, self-developing process where contradictions are not negated or replaced, but rather sublated, aufgehoben, preserved, transcended, and integrated into a higher unity. The absolute knowing is another Hegel's concept that is often misunderstood, sometimes being interpreted as a supernatural state where an individual possesses all knowledge in the universe. This misinterpretation reduces Hegel's profound philosophical insight into an absurd caricature, leading critics like Schopenhauer to dismiss his philosophy outright. For instance, Schopenhauer considered Hegel foolish because he believed that absolute knowledge in the literal sense was unattainable. However, this critique stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of what Hegel means by absolute knowing. Absolute knowing is not about literally knowing everything. Hegel does not claim that any person can encompass all possible knowledge. Instead, absolute knowing is the recognition that the individual subject is not separate from the whole, but is deeply embedded within it. It is the awareness that reality, in its entirety, is unified, self-contained, and self-determining. This reality is what Hegel refers to as absolute spirit, the foundation of all possible knowledge and existence. In this sense, absolute knowing is the realization that you, as a subject, are participating in the unfolding of reality itself. Reality, or the absolute spirit, is not something external or apart from us. It is the whole of existence, containing all potential knowledge within itself, here and now. Absolute knowing is the awareness that there is nothing outside of this whole. It has no external point of comparison because it is everything that exists. Thus, the knowledge contained within the Absolute Spirit is not something to be acquired or possessed in a literal sense. It is the recognition of being an integral part of this self-contained totality. This does not mean that any individual knows everything. Far from it. The process of realizing or discovering knowledge is an ongoing endeavor, unfolding over time through humanity's collective engagement with reality. Absolute knowing is not about the completeness of individual understanding, but about recognizing the unity of all existence and the participation of every individual in this greater whole. In other words, Hegel's absolute knowing is the insight that all knowledge exists within the Absolute Spirit, which includes us as parts of the whole, and that this knowledge is always available within the totality of reality. Whether or not this knowledge is fully realized by humanity is a separate matter. Absolute knowing acknowledges that reality is self-contained, self-dependent, and contains no external elements. Thus we, as expressions of the Absolute Spirit, share in the unfolding of all possible knowledge. In late modern philosophy, Charles S. Peirce, a key figure in American pragmatism, broadens the discussion by offering a general definition of an object as anything that we can think or talk about. Peirce's inclusive approach encompasses tangible entities like the pyramids or stars, abstract concepts such as numbers or disbelief, and even subjective experiences like fears. The notions of the unitary, autonomous subject foundational to Enlightenment thought and liberal theories of the social contract faced significant challenges from the works of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. These thinkers fundamentally questioned the coherence and autonomy of the subject, laying the groundwork for the deconstruction of subjectivity as a central metaphysical concept in the Continental tradition. Freud's exploration of the unconscious mind radically undermined Enlightenment ideas of rational, self-transparent subjectivity. His model suggested that human behavior and identity are deeply influenced by unconscious drives, desires, and conflicts, leaving the subject fragmented and often unaware of its true motivations. In this view, the conscious self is not the master of its own house, as Freud famously remarked, but rather a fragile construct subject to deeper forces. Building on Freud's insights, Jacques Lacan reinterpreted the psychoanalytic subject through a structuralist lens, influenced by Martin Heidegger and Ferdinand de Saussure. Lacan's model describes the subject as split, perpetually alienated from a state of jouissance, complete satisfaction, through its entry into the symbolic order of language. This division occurs in stages. The real, a pre-linguistic state where there is no separation between the self and the world. The imaginary, marked by the mirror stage, where the subject first recognizes itself as an image but misrecognizes this image as a coherent whole, creating a false sense of unity. The symbolic, the realm of language and social structures, where the subject's identity is shaped and constrained by linguistic and cultural systems, such as the name of the father, which imposes rules and limits on desire. For Lacan, the subject is not a unified entity but a fractured being caught in a web of desire, language, and symbolic constraints. In contrast, Martin Heidegger displaces traditional notions of the subject entirely with his concept of Das-Sein, beingness. Heidegger rejects the subject-object dichotomy, positing that the subject, Das-Sein, and the world are inseparably intertwined. There is no subject without the world, nor world without the subject, as they exist in a fundamental relationship of co-constitution. Heidegger's phenomenology seeks to uncover the primordial conditions of this relationship, moving beyond classical metaphysics and focusing on being itself rather than the subject as an isolated entity. Later thinkers such as Louis Althusser and Michel Foucault further dismantled the idea of the autonomous subject by theorizing it as a social construction. Althusser, a structural Marxist, argued that subjectivity is produced through interpolation, the process by which ideological systems, or ideological state apparatuses, hail individuals into predefined roles. For Althusser, the subject is always already constituted by ideology, which not only defines individual identity but also maintains the broader metaphysical framework of the subject. Foucault, meanwhile, approached subjectivity as an effect of power relations and disciplinary systems. In works like Discipline and Punish, he described how institutions such as schools, prisons, and militaries produce specific kinds of subjects: students, criminals, soldiers, through techniques of subjectification. Foucault viewed the subject not as a fixed entity, but as a dynamic construct shaped by shifting power dynamics and discourses. However, he also explored the possibility of transforming oneself through practices of self-cultivation or ethopoiesis, emphasizing the creative potential for individuals to reshape their identities. The post-structuralist critique of the subject was extended by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who rejected the idea of a singular, stable subject altogether. Instead, they proposed a fluid and fragmented model of subjectivity, emphasizing processes of desiring production and the constant flux of identities and relations. The evolution of the concept of the subject continued in 20th-century philosophy, particularly through the works of Bertrand Russell and Thomas Nagel, who approached the interplay between subjectivity and objectivity in innovative ways. Russell, building on classical terminology, introduced the concept of the fact, aiming to clarify the distinction between subjective beliefs and objective truths. Russell initially defined facts as distinct from objects. In his 1918 lectures, he argued that facts are not particular existing things like Socrates or the sun. Instead, they are the truths about those things. For instance, the fact that Socrates existed is not Socrates himself, but a proposition reflecting the relationship between objects and their qualities. By 1919, Russell nuanced his position, identifying facts as complex entities, which may include objects as constituents. For example, the fact that Socrates was Greek involves Socrates as part of the fact, but extends beyond him to describe a relational truth. Russell further distinguished facts from beliefs, emphasizing the subjective nature of beliefs and their potential for error. Beliefs originate from the knower and are subject to reality testing, a process of verifying beliefs against facts. For Russell, truth is a property of beliefs that correspond to facts, and knowledge consists of true beliefs grounded in such correspondence. This distinction underscores the tension between the subjective experience of the knower and the objective reality they seek to understand. The tension between subjectivity and objectivity takes center stage in Thomas Nagel's philosophy. In his seminal essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, Nagel argues that subjective experience, the what-it-is-like aspect of being a conscious entity, resists full explanation through objective, scientific methods. He highlights the irreducible nature of first-person perspectives, which cannot be entirely captured by third-person descriptions. Nagel extends this argument in The View from Nowhere, where he examines the paradox of objectivity. While an objective viewpoint aims to transcend individual perspectives, it cannot eliminate the unique, situated perspective of the subject observing it. He famously asks, "What kind of fact is it that I am Thomas Nagel?" This question encapsulates the tension between subjective self-awareness and the broader, impersonal view of reality. Each subject, according to Nagel, occupies a unique position in the universe, yet these individual perspectives collectively contribute to the view from nowhere, a hypothetical, all-encompassing vantage point. Nagel's insights also intersect with discussions of qualia, the intrinsic, ineffable qualities of subjective experience. Frank Cameron Jackson's thought experiment Mary's Room illustrates the problem. Even if Mary, a scientist, knows everything objectively about the color red, she learns something new when she experiences it for the first time. This highlights the gap between objective knowledge and subjective experience, further complicating the understanding of the subject. Nagel's reflections resonate with certain metaphysical views, such as the Indian concept of Brahman, which conceives of ultimate reality as a unified, timeless existence. In this framework, individual subjects are seen as aspects of a single, universal consciousness. Subjectivity arises from the segmentation of this unity through sensory and cognitive mechanisms, creating the illusion of separateness. This perspective aligns with Hegel's idea of a subjective perspective embedded within a larger, objective whole, suggesting that the subject is both distinct and inseparably connected to the broader fabric of existence. The philosophical distinction between subjectivity and objectivity has been central to epistemology and metaphysics, evolving through the contributions of countless thinkers over centuries. At its core, something is considered subjective if it depends on a mind, such as biases, perceptions, emotions, or opinions, while something is objective if it exists independently of any mind, remaining true regardless of individual perspectives. This fundamental dichotomy has been nuanced and debated extensively, with subjectivity often associated with the variability of individual experience and objectivity with the pursuit of universal, independent truths. Plato's philosophy laid an early foundation for exploring these ideas. In his Republic, Socrates challenges the relativism of Thrasymachus, proposing that justice and ethical truths have an objective, mathematical structure akin to geometry. For Plato, the realm of opinion belongs to the shifting and unreliable world of the senses, whereas true knowledge resides in the immutable realm of forms, eternal and incorporeal entities that can only be apprehended through reason. This distinction established a framework for moral objectivism in Western philosophy, treating ethics as a precise discipline governed by impartial standards. Plato's insistence on separating opinion from knowledge and aligning truth with an objective reality became a cornerstone for resolving questions of reality, existence, and truth. While Platonic idealism asserts that ideas exist independently of individuals, other traditions have challenged or refined this perspective. George Berkeley's empirical idealism, for instance, holds that existence is fundamentally tied to perception. Things exist only insofar as they are perceived by a mind. This approach reimagines objectivity not as independence from perception, but as a consistent framework within shared experiences. Berkeley's philosophy underscores the challenge of distinguishing between subjective and objective knowledge, especially when all experience is mediated by perception. The tension between subjectivity and objectivity has also led to the development of intermediary concepts like intersubjectivity. This idea acknowledges the shared space of understanding among subjects, bridging the gap between purely subjective experiences and claims of objectivity. Such frameworks challenge the rigid opposition of subjectivity and objectivity, suggesting instead that they exist on a spectrum or in mutual dependence. For example, Hegel's exploration of the view from nowhere suggests that even an ostensibly objective perspective is rooted in subjective consciousness, creating an interplay between individual perspectives and collective understanding. The concept of subjectivity, though central to many philosophical inquiries, has often been treated as peripheral, tied to broader themes like skepticism, individuality, and existentialism. The tension between subjectivity and objectivity extends beyond philosophy into fields such as science, history, and even quantum mechanics, where questions about the nature of reality and perception come to the forefront. Isaac Newton's application of the scientific method contrasted sharply with René Descartes' introspective deductions, shifting the emphasis toward evidence-based hypotheses. Newton's approach emphasized observation and experimentation as tools to uncover an objective reality, a method that profoundly shaped the development of modern science. This commitment to objectivity was further refined by thinkers like Gottlob Frege, who sought to ground objectivity in the logical structure of propositions. Frege argued that if reality exists independently of consciousness, it must encompass forms and structures that defy subjective interpretation. Objectivity, for Frege, requires a coherent framework of truth based on propositions with defined truth values, creating a systematic ontology that commits to the existence of external objects and their independent reality. The philosophy of science continues to grapple with the role of perception in discerning objective truths, particularly in light of the observer effect in quantum mechanics. This phenomenon, where the act of observation appears to influence the behavior of particles, raises questions about whether objective reality is accessible at all without the interference of perception. Direct realists argue that perception provides a reliable window into reality, while instrumentalists contend that observations are merely tools for predicting phenomena, not necessarily for understanding their true nature. Philosophers of mind have extended this debate, exploring whether perceptual constancy, our ability to perceive objects as stable despite changing conditions, underpins objectivity or is itself a subjective construct. The historical discipline offers another lens through which to examine the challenges of objectivity. Historians like Leopold von Ranke championed the use of archival documents, asserting that these physical artifacts offer a more stable and reliable account of the past than subjective memories, which are prone to distortion. This emphasis on material evidence sought to anchor history in an objective framework, treating objects as impartial witnesses to bygone eras. Historians strive to piece together disparate accounts, artifacts, and perspectives to construct narratives that best approximate what actually happened. Yet, the very act of selecting and interpreting evidence involves subjective judgment, blurring the line between objective reconstruction and subjective storytelling. Michel Rolf Trouillot's concepts of historicity 1, H1, and historicity 2, H2, offer a framework for understanding the interplay between the objective reality of socio-historical processes and the subjective narratives constructed around them. H1, the material reality of events as they occur, aligns with the notion of objective truth, encompassing the facts of what has happened in history. In contrast, H2 represents the subjective interpretations, perspectives, and stories that humanity weaves together to make sense of these events. This distinction underscores the complex relationship between objective historical events and their representation in human narratives, which are inevitably shaped by cultural, social, and political forces. In Silencing the Past, Trouillot explores how power dynamics shape historical understanding, identifying 4 critical stages where historical silences are created. Who gets to document history? Access to literacy, wealth, and power influences whose accounts are preserved. For example, the records of marginalized or illiterate groups are often absent, leaving gaps in historical evidence. Decisions about which documents are preserved, categorized, and stored affect the accessibility and prioritization of historical materials. These choices, often guided by institutional biases, determine what is deemed important for posterity. Historical narratives are shaped by whose voices are amplified and whose are ignored. This process involves decisions about which accounts are credible and worthy of inclusion in the broader story. The retrospective framing of the past as a cohesive whole is influenced by present-day perspectives, ideologies, and priorities, often privileging dominant voices and erasing others. These mechanisms demonstrate that history is not a neutral or purely objective account, but a dynamic and contested field. The narratives that emerge are shaped by power relations, reflecting not only what happened, but also who had the authority to define what matters. Subjectivity, while deeply personal, is also profoundly social, emerging through continuous interactions within the web of society. This dual nature means that as much as subjectivity contributes to individuation, it also entails a dynamic process of socialization. The individual is never an isolated entity, but constantly engages with the surrounding cultural, political, and natural environments. In this interplay, culture functions as a living totality, a collective subjectivity that is both shaped by individuals and reshapes them in return. As cultures evolve, so too does the subjective experience of their members, influenced by the economy, political structures, communities, and the natural world. Although the boundaries of cultures are fluid and arbitrary, the subjectivity that each culture engenders is recognizable and often distinct. This cultural subjectivity constitutes a particular way of organizing and experiencing reality. It determines how individuals perceive and interact with others, objects, consciousness, and the natural world. The divergence between cultural subjectivities can create experiences such as culture shock, where one's ingrained ways of perceiving and interacting with the world are confronted by the unfamiliar subjectivity of another culture. This disjunction often results in a sense of alienation or incomprehension, highlighting the profound influence of culture on individual subjectivity. The concept of political subjectivity has gained prominence in social sciences and humanities, emphasizing the deeply embedded nature of subjectivity within systems of power and meaning. Political subjectivity reflects how individuals internalize and navigate their roles within these systems. In Meaning, Madness, and Political Subjectivity, Sodek Rahimi argues that politicality is not an external attribute but the fundamental mode of a subject's existence. This perspective highlights how individuals are shaped by and contribute to the political frameworks that define their societies, from governmental structures to social movements. While subjectivity shapes human experience, fields such as science, ethics, and journalism strive to cultivate objectivity as a counterbalance to personal biases and cultural influences. In journalism, objectivity involves reporting facts with minimal personal or political bias. This principle strives for impartiality, ensuring that news is conveyed in a manner that allows audiences to form their own judgments based on reliable and neutral information. The interplay between subjectivity and objectivity remains a critical philosophical and practical issue. While objectivity aspires to transcend individual and cultural biases, subjectivity understands the personal and cultural lenses through which reality is perceived. Both modes of understanding are essential. Subjectivity offers depth and nuance, rooted in personal and cultural experience, while objectivity seeks universal truths that can bridge individual differences.